Hvaljeni su si Marija, dragi pratitelji YouTube kanala Udruge Hrvatska za život. Evo, trenutno snimamo još jedan podcast Život ovdje u Crkvi Bezgrješnog Srca Marijina na Jordanovcu u Zagrebu. U gostima nam je Ramona Treviño, ona je direktorica jednog dijela 40 dana za život iz Amerike, dolazi nam iz Teksasa, ima 47 godina, ona je supruga, majka i baka, a danas će nam posvjedočiti o svom životu, o svom velikom obraćenju sa pro-choice-a na pro-life, odnosno od osobe koja je bila za pobačaj do one koja je sada jako za život. Ramona, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here in Croatia.
Thank you. Can you please tell us about your roles now in your life? Who is Ramona at this moment?
Who is Ramona at this moment? Well, I am a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, so that's my primary role, and I'm currently working as the Director of Outreach for the 40 Days for Life national team back home in Texas, and just continue to promote life and try to balance my work in the pro-life efforts with my most important work, which is that of a mother and a grandmother and a wife.
And what does it mean, Director of Outreach? What do you do?
I would love to know as well. Well, as Director of Outreach, part of my role is to continue to promote 40 Days for Life, to encourage our leaders, encourage more volunteers, just really to try to go out and bring more people into the fold of 40 Days for Life. That's really the simplest answer, yes.
Thank you so very much for coming here in Croatia. We have our 7th international conference, Now Choose Life, and you are here as our guest, so we are very thankful and grateful to have you here.
Well, I'm extremely grateful too to be here with you.
Can you please tell us something about your childhood, your religious background, your family, and everything?
Yes, so I was baptized as a Catholic when we were babies, my sister and I. I'm the youngest of two. And I would call our family more cultural Catholic. We weren't really faithful in the terms of living out our Catholic faith. So my mom and dad were both married in the Catholic Church, but we weren't really raised with any faith formation. So the only sacrament I received was baptism. And we practiced in the sense that culturally we embraced the things of Catholicism. So, you know, having rosaries and maybe on occasion, you know, praying rosaries, images, religious images, mostly of Our Lady of Guadalupe was very prominent, and just really just celebrating Easter, Christmas, and we practiced Lent as well. So we followed Lenten practices of abstaining from meat on Fridays and giving up things during Lent and things like that. But I didn't really have the formation and the understanding of why. So we did it, but we never knew why we did it as children, you know, and my parents never really talked about that or discussed that. And it could be that they failed themselves to really understand their faith. But I think it was, despite not having that formation, I think having some of that in my life was very instrumental in really having the grace that ultimately, you know, led to my full conversion back to my faith. As you know, I used to work for Planned Parenthood, and but before all of that, I was pregnant at 16 years old, and it was quite a shock to my family. But it was also, I was also extremely blessed that my parents never considered abortion for me. And I never considered abortion for myself. So being pro-life, even though we never talked about abortion in our family. It just wasn't a subject that we talked about, even though it was very, very legal in the United States. But during that time in the 90s when I became pregnant, you know, it just wasn't something that we talked about. And so I think just naturally, when I became pregnant, I knew, you know, that I was a mom in that moment. So it never was a thought. And I was very blessed because my parents never suggested it to me, especially considering that I was so young. And oftentimes we see a lot of young girls whose parents are the ones who often pressure them to have abortions. But I was in a very abusive relationship with the father of my daughter, very toxic and unhealthy relationship. And I was in that for 8 years before I finally left, you know, and found the courage to face life alone as a single mother. And my faith, even though I didn't really practice it, played such a huge role in being able to really see that God wanted more for me, that this was not part of his plan for me to be in that type of situation, and especially wanted more for my daughter. And so I got out of that relationship, and praise be to God, it would lead me to my now husband of 18 years. Yeah.
And what did you do? How did you manage your life with a child, with school? How did your friends react of that news and everything? How was the...
Yeah, so I was a really good student. I made really good grades in school. And when I became pregnant, everyone said I ruined my life. You know, that was the talk of the town. And so I come from I live still in my hometown, but it's a very small town of around 1,000 people. And so everyone knows everyone, you know, and when you are in a school where everyone literally knows everybody and you're pregnant, you can imagine the scandal. And I was going to school pregnant. So I was very young and I went to school pregnant, and everyone, you know, whispered behind my back that I had ruined my life, you know, and that I had so much going for me, and now what was I going to do, right? But I ended up quitting high school, and I just couldn't handle not just the pressure from school, but also the emotional abuse that I was going through at home with the father of my daughter. So there was a lot of things that were going on behind the scenes, and I ended up, you know, quitting school and just going to work in the workforce and trying to raise my daughter and support my daughter. And again, I'm so grateful to my mom and dad, because they were there still supporting me. They never kicked me out of the house or anything like that. They were there. And I look back and I think, gosh, I was so lucky and blessed to have parents who were so supportive. And they had their own problems. My dad was an alcoholic for most of my life. He's passed away now, but for the majority of his life and my life, he was an alcoholic. But despite the troubles that my mom and dad had in their marriage, and obviously my father's alcoholism, they loved me, and they loved my sister, and they loved their granddaughter, and they were always very supportive of life and of their daughter, you know, daughter's choice to have this baby. And so for that, I'm very, very grateful.
We talked last night about love and marriage, and how many people, young people, just don't believe in marriage in these days. And I think if you had your primary family who is very good, who is married and who are together despite of everything that they have, problems and everything, you truly believe in marriage. And whether you get to know someone who is not good for you or anything, but you still have a hope, I can do it. I think that I have something in my heart that can be given to someone.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you bring that up, actually, because this is a discussion that we have a lot in my home about the sacrament of marriage, and really how important that sacrament is. Because I think what happens is a lot of younger people, and in this new generation, they have forgotten and lost sight of the sacrament, and they're opting to get married outside of the church because it's more about a party, and it's more about just the festivities of getting married versus the sacrament itself. And I think for me, I definitely was influenced by my parents' commitment to their marriage. It was broken, you know. There was a lot of brokenness in their marriage, and lots of things that I wish, you know, they had healed and worked on, right? but I think the example of their commitment to their sacrament is what influenced me to knowing that one day I want what my mom and dad had, which was the sacrament of marriage, and take what was beautiful and have that, and then take what was not and fix it. You know, so where they didn't fix it, I want to be able to ensure that I have something better, but also still have the most important part, which is the sacrament of marriage.
You said that you had very abusive relationship with the father of your child, and can you tell me, was it some kind of moment when you realized it doesn't have any sense anymore, or it was just a lot of things and you said, I'm done?
Yeah, so it was a lot of things. And what was, looking back, you know, I prayed a lot for him to change, for things to get better. And what I realized is, you know, he had the free will to change. And God was saying to me, if he's not going to change, then you don't deserve this, right? That you deserve better. And so there came a moment, a final moment, where I was humiliated at my job because I found out that he was, you know, cheating on me. And that was it. I couldn't take any more. You know, there was physical abuse, there was emotional abuse, verbal abuse, psychological abuse. I mean, all the abuses, sexual abuse, you know, I endured it all. But I think that moment of humiliation, you know, in public is what just, it was almost like eye-opening. And it was very interesting how it happened, because just a few weeks before that, I had just put myself on my knees and humbled myself before the Lord. And instead of praying for change, I simply asked God, and I still remember this happened a very long time ago, but I still remember praying and submitting myself and just asking the Lord to open my eyes to the truth. That if I was not supposed to be in this relationship, and if he wanted something more for me, just show me, reveal it to me in plain sight. And then just a week or two later is when that was revealed to me. And so I saw that as an answer to my prayer, as painful as it was, because I think for anyone who's in a very long relationship with someone that they love and they share a child with, you know, it is very painful to come to the realization that it's all just, you know, for nothing, you know. And I grieved the end of something that really just was never meant to be. And but it was also such a huge blessing, because again, if it had not been for her finally leaving and recognizing my own worth, you know, I would not have met my now husband of 18 years.
For those ladies who are out there and having also abusive relationship, can you tell me, did you just cut him out of your life? Did you just grow and you say, no more of you in my life? Or how was it? Were you scared? I'm sure they also are scared and everything. So how was the moment of leaving and traumatized, maybe scared if he's coming back for you, for child, threats or something like that?
Yeah, so you know, it was interesting. I think what it was is I got to a point where I finally saw my worth and value in God's eyes. I think that was what was really the eye-opening moment, where for all of those years, when someone is verbally abusing you, when someone's always making you feel less than, unworthy, there's a lot of psychological abuse there that happens where you think that you deserve it, you know, and that you don't deserve better. And so you keep hanging on thinking it's going to change, it's going to get better, and it never does. And for a little bit it's good, you know. So you have these moments of beauty and wonderful times and fun times, and then you have the abuse, and it's just an ongoing cycle that never ends. And that, I think, just the one day, you know, God gave me this grace to realize that I deserved better than that, and that if he truly loved me, then he wouldn't treat me this way. And that's really where the courage came from, to say enough, and realizing that, okay, I'm going to walk away from this. And if he really loves me, he will change and he'll work on himself. But he'll have to do that on his own to prove that he really, loves me and his daughter and he wants this to work. And he never did. And so when he didn't do that, I realized this is not it. This is not what God wants for me. It's not what God wanted for me. It's what I wanted for me. I wasn't submitting my life to God's will, nor was I ever praying for the right man to come into my life, but I was a child. When we met, I was 16 years old, or I think I was 15, turning 16, and when we met, so I was a child. And I wasn't thinking, like a woman. And of course, having a child out of wedlock as a child, you feel stuck in that relationship, and you don't really understand, how to pray for a husband, how to be chaste before marriage, and understand how important those things are so that you can really understand who you're marrying and if that person that you're marrying really loves you for you. And so that's what I left is just all of that, and then met my husband, and then I could see that, yes, this is the man who is going to respect me, who's going to honor me, who's going to be faithful to me, and who's going to truly love me.
And he said yes to all of your life and to everything that he just accept all of that.
Yeah. Well, I have had a daughter, my daughter at the time that I met my husband, but he also had a daughter. And he had also gone through some things too, difficult things. And I think that was what was really important, is that we both understood each other, and we both had been through some difficult times. So we understood what it was like to to go through difficult relationships and to go through difficult moments, and then to be able to come together and relate and share that and understand one another, to be able to accept one another for the mistakes that we made in our pasts and want something better for ourselves.
I loved when you said yesterday that you both didn't have a sacrament and you know that you want it. Yes.
Yeah, we grew up very similar. He had baptism and communion. So first he had his first communion. I had not, but we were not confirmed in the church. And so when we were engaged, we went through, RCIA, which is the rite of Christian initiation for adults in the Catholic faith, and to come fully into the church, so that we could get married in the Catholic Church. And although we knew that was necessary for, us to get married in the church, and again, I think part of that was, we had this longing and this desire to be married in the Catholic Church. We may not have really at that time understood, what that meant in terms of living out our faith as a Catholic couple, but there was this longing that we both had to be married in the Catholic Church, and thank God that we did, because it got us through some very difficult times.
That's so nice. Thank you so much. Planned Parenthood in your life, how did you get in?
That's the difficult time. That's the difficult time, yes. So when my husband and I were married in 2006, and we had our first child immediately. We conceived our first child just a month after we were married, despite the fact that doctors told me that I probably wouldn't be able to conceive. And so we conceived our son a month after, and he was born premature, and it was a pretty traumatic time for both of us. Yes, absolutely. So I suffered from endometriosis for, I'm assuming, all of my life. And I was really, really struggling with pain. And when I went to see my physician, he wanted to do surgery to look inside and see, what was happening. And this was just right after my husband and I got married. We were married in June of 2006, and I had the surgery in August. And in July, we had conceived our son, but I didn't know that we had conceived. So we had had my surgery. Forgive me, I think it was July that I had my surgery, because he was conceived in July, and then I had my surgery towards the end of July. And the doctor, you know, when I came in for my follow-up after the post-surgery, the doctor had told me that the endometriosis was everywhere, fallopian tubes, you know, ovaries, everywhere. And he said it would probably be very difficult, if at all possible, for me to conceive naturally. And I remember the conversation my husband and I had on the drive home after the appointment, and I was really sad because I had hoped that my husband and I would have children together, and we spoke about how we wouldn't opt for any type of, you know, infertility treatments or anything like that. Just, I had never really learned about the church's teaching on those things, but just instinctively I knew that if it was God's will for us to have children, that it would happen, and if it wasn't, then we would just have to accept God's will. And my husband agreed with me, you know, and shortly after, a few days later, I began to feel sick, and I was vomiting, and I don't know why, but I just felt like I should take a pregnancy test. And so it turned out I was pregnant, and I had already conceived. I had already conceived our son. So I was pregnant during my surgery. And
did the doctors never saw it?
Never saw it, never. And so I called the doctor and I said, you know, I explained to him that my pregnancy test was positive, and the doctor was in shock. And I heard him exclaim, because I was on the phone with the nurse, and the nurse said, let me talk to the doctor. And I heard the doctor say, what? You know? And so I spoke with him about it, and I said, I just want to know if my baby's going to be okay, you know? And he said, well, of course, yes, the baby's going to be fine. But I really don't know if the doctor knew how to reply to or respond to that, you know? But it was just a miracle. And ultimately, during the pregnancy went fine, but there was some issues that I had towards the end, going into my third trimester, where just I had a lot of pain happening inside my womb. And the doctor thinks that it was because it was the scar tissue from the surgery that was stretching and causing a lot of pain. But I felt like something wasn't right. And I ended up going into early labor, and at 33 weeks. So my son was born at 33 weeks, and he was in the NICU, which is the neonatal intensive care unit. And he was in the NICU for 12 days, which was really incredible, but also very traumatizing as well for anyone who's ever had a baby born premature. To leave the hospital without your baby in your arms is very traumatic. But interestingly, during that time, I wasn't really practicing my faith. I mean, we would go to Mass sometimes. But what I had done while my son was in the NICU was entrusted him to Our Lady. And that was because I couldn't be there all the time. We lived far from the hospital. And so I would spend all day at the hospital with him, and then I'd have to go home, and it would break my heart leaving my son with the nurses. So I entrusted him to Our Lady, so that Our Lady would protect him and care for him as a mother would, right? Because only a mother could give that type of love, and I knew that Our Lady could do that if I wasn't there. And so, yeah, so I entrusted him to Our Lady, and he was released very early at 12 days, which was incredible. And
how old is he now?
He's 18 now, yes, and he's very tall and just a big boy. Yeah, you would never know that he was born premature. Yeah.
So you don't have him only with your first child, but God was faithful.
God was faithful. Well, we had our son, and because of the trauma of having that experience, we decided we would not have more children. So my husband and I said, no, we can't go through this again, so we're not going to have any more kids. I learned that once you have one premature child, that the odds of having more children, you know, premature children, go up, and that it was very possible to have another premature baby. So we said, we're not going to have any more kids, and so I was contracepting. And when my son turned a year old, that's when I went to work for Planned Parenthood. And I'll tell that before we talk about the other children, because the other children would not be here had it not been for my conversion. Yeah, so in 2008, I accepted a position working for Planned Parenthood. So our son was born, and I was married in 2006 in the Catholic Church. And in 2007, our son was born. And then in 2008 is when I started working for Planned Parenthood.
How was that? How did you decide to work there?
Yeah, so for those who are unfamiliar with Planned Parenthood is the largest abortion provider in the United States. They commit over 300,000 abortions every year. And so they're very, very well known in the States as an abortion provider. And I didn't know that about Planned Parenthood. I think because they have done a really good job of marketing themselves as healthcare. And so I just thought, oh, Planned Parenthood, that's where girls go to get birth control and pap smears and STD tests and pregnancy tests and things like that. And so I actually learned about this position from an ex-coworker of mine. So we used to work together at the health department. And she was working for Planned Parenthood, and she called me to tell me about an opportunity to be the director of a clinic. And she said, I thought of you, I thought you'd be perfect for this position, and I was thinking you should apply. And it so happened that when she called me, I was looking for a job. I was looking for a job because I had been a stay-at-home mom at that point for a year with our son. And I was really just restless and wanting to get out and go back to work. That was the first time in my life I'd ever, been a stay-at-home mom. I'd never, not worked outside of the home. And I was not understanding the value of being a stay-at-home mom. I was more listening to the world of how, women should go out and work and be independent and we should have our own income and things like that, right? The lie of feminism. And so I thought, okay, I'm ready to get back to work. And I was looking for a part-time job because I wanted to balance work with family. And I wanted something that paid well and gave me a good opportunity. And so this presented itself at the perfect time, right? Because it was part-time. It was only 3 days a week, and it was not too far from my home, about 25 minutes, drive to work. And it presented an opportunity for me to be the director, and I thought, oh, this is great, because I can, put this on my resume and maybe later do something else, right? And so funny how the enemy, answers all of our desires. And when we're not discerning who is speaking to us, we can get into trouble. And so definitely that was not from God. And so I accepted the position working for Planned Parenthood. And part of the reason that I accepted it was because abortions were not happening there. We were part of an affiliate that had, I think, probably 26 or 27 total clinics. And 2 of them in that affiliate is where the abortions took place. And the others were referral centers, like the one that I directed. And so we were a referral center, but we were called a family planning center. And that's how I justified my position, was that, I'm not doing abortions here. I'm trying to help prevent abortions, is what I believed.
So what did you do over there? What was your role?
Yeah, so we were like a gynecologist's office, similar. We offered women exams and pap smears and, breast exams and birth control and pregnancy test, STD testing and treatment. But that was it. That was it. That was the scope of the work. So, oftentimes women like to defend Planned Parenthood and say, oh, well, what will we do without Planned Parenthood? Well, you can see a real doctor. You can see a real doctor, because a lot of issues that women had, we couldn't treat. If women complained of any type of issue that we couldn't solve, we couldn't help them.
So you just detect the problem maybe and then send them...
Or even just suspect the problem, because there wasn't any ultrasound machines, or there wasn't anything to really be able to diagnose some of the issues that women had. So, and there's not a doctor on site. So the only doctor is at the abortion center. So all of the referral centers are run by nurse practitioners. You know, they have a good position and degree, and but they're not physicians. And so the nurse practitioners are the ones doing the work. And oftentimes, if women presented themselves with some issue that we couldn't solve or resolve, then the nurse practitioner would just refer them to see, you know, a gynecologist.
And what did you say about the contraception? You also gave them to ladies who come?
Oh yeah, so the big thing was contraception, you know, pushing contraception. And I went into working for Planned Parenthood thinking, you know, we were helping women, and you really realize that it's not women you're serving, it's children. So that's the majority of the clients are, and I call them clients, I don't like to call them patients, because it's all about money with Planned Parenthood. And so when you're seeing these clients, the majority are children. I would say between the ages of 16 and 18 were the majority of the girls that came into Planned Parenthood. And it's all just because the birth control. You know, they're all coming in just for birth control. And I quickly realized over time that that it's really about creating a market for abortion. That's ultimately what Planned Parenthood is doing, is they're just continuously creating the market and the demand for abortion, because you've got all of these young girls going in, and they don't have to have parental consent. They don't have to have their parents with them. They can just go in and get on birth control and live a promiscuous life that will ultimately lead to unplanned pregnancies, and then they end up getting abortions.
That's so sad. That's so sad.
Yeah, and it's sad because part of the reasoning for me is that what I realized after all these years later is that there was so much that I had gone through in my previous relationship that was left unhealed. And I think whenever we have these wounds, Satan has a way of capitalizing on those wounds, taking advantage of us and twisting it, you know, so that he can use it. And I think part of that was thinking that I was helping young girls so that they wouldn't experience what I experienced as a young girl. You know, I never felt any regret for being a mother. I never regretted, you know, my daughter. But what I did experience was watching my daughter suffer because her father abandoned her, you know. He didn't have anything else to do with her after we split. And I think because of that pain and that's the suffering that I endured watching my own daughter suffer, I thought I was helping prevent that from happening in other young girls. And so when these young girls would come in who were, you know, 16, 17, 18 years old, I think I could see my former self, my younger self in those girls. And I thought, oh, you know, they need to be on birth control. They should never have children, you know. Instead of realizing that what I was doing was helping just perpetuate the ongoing abuse of these girls, the objectification of these girls, because that's what was happening. Is these young girls were allowing themselves to be objects, to just be used, and living promiscuously, having multiple sexual partners, contracting STDs, being treated for STDs, going right back out to living that life. And to a point, it hurt me. And I would, over time, I would just think to myself, what am I doing? What am I doing here? I don't know how I'm helping these girls.
How long did you work?
3 years.
3 years.
3 years.
And what about trafficking, and you mentioned yesterday?
Yeah. So at the end of going into the 3rd year of working for Planned Parenthood, one of the things that we often saw, and this is very common throughout every Planned Parenthood, is you see cases of statutory rape. So, you know, we'd see young girls 16 years old, 15 years old who were in relationships, sexual relationships with a bunch of older boys. So sometimes 19, 20, 21, you know, men, young men with these young girls. And instead of us saying, you know, we're not going to sell you birth control, you do not need to be in this relationship, and reporting this, because we did report it, but honestly, I don't know who we were sending the report to, you know, because they still left with birth control. And that told me that, wait a second, we're still sending them out with birth control, giving them the green light to be right back into this relationship with their abuser, you know. And so that was an ongoing issue. But in early of 2011, so January of 2011, Live Action, who's an amazing pro-life organization in the States led by Lila Rose, who's just an incredible warrior for life.
And she was so young when she started.
She was so young when she founded Live Action, like 14 or 15 years old. Yeah, it's incredible. And so Live Action had released a series of undercover investigative videos, which they're very known for doing. And that particular year was a series exposing Planned Parenthood employees willing to cover up sex trafficking. And we were called into a training, or at least we thought it was a training, on how to report abuse, if suspected abuse. And it turned out that it was not a training to train us on how to report, but rather how to not get caught. That's what they were training us on. And it was that time that I realized, like, God really opened my eyes and made me realize this is not an organization that I want to represent. I hadn't reached the level of understanding my own personal role in abortion. I still believed that, oh, you know, I'm not doing abortions here, so I'm okay, you know. But when it came to the sexual abuse, I think that's what really hit close to home for me, because of just my own experiences, having, you know, been pregnant at a young age, and being, at the time when I was 16, the father of my daughter was 19, so he was older. And then also having been subjected to sexual abuse in that relationship as well. But also just as a mother, you know, my daughter was a teenage girl at the time, and my stepdaughter was early teens as well. And as a mother of two, you know, girls, it was difficult for me to go to work every day and continue to promote this life that I wouldn't have promoted for my own children. And to work and defend and represent an organization that was willing to cover up sex abuse of young girls. I just couldn't reconcile that with myself.
And what was the moment you said that you had a meeting?
Yes.
And they show you the video?
They showed the videos, and so that we thought it was a retraining of us to just really learn about signs of sex trafficking and what to do if something like that really happened. Obviously, you know, with the undercover investigative videos, it was all, you know, actors, you know, they were portraying as, you know, pimps and young age girls, but it could really happen, you know, and obviously we saw it with statutory rape, right? But those type of scenarios are real, and even though it hadn't happened, I thought, well, it could, you know, and I want to know what I do, you know, as a clinic director to report this, or what signs to look for, what steps to take, right? And instead of being trained on that, we were told how to identify if we were being videotaped or recorded, or if we were under investigation by some of these pro-life groups.
And they asked if someone has any questions?
Yeah, if you have questions.
I love that moment.
Yeah, so they, you know, were turned on the lights after they showed the film and asked, you know, does anyone have questions? And I just sat there and I thought, yeah, I have a lot of questions, you know. I don't understand what's going on here. I thought, you're showing us what not to do, right? And she said, no, Ramona, we're trying to explain that these groups come in, you know, and they are undercover, and we want you all to know how to avoid it and when to recognize. So instead of looking for signs of sex trafficking, look for signs that you're being videotaped. Look for signs on people coming in to investigate undercover.
Were you the only one who understood?
I don't think so. I think I was the only one, definitely was the only one who said something and had a question. But I looked around the room and I thought, surely I can't be the only one who's hearing this right now. And still, after all of these years, I think, am I crazy? Did I dream that? You know, because how could everyone stay? And I think they're just so brainwashed into defending Planned Parenthood and defending abortion. And they have to, you know, people have to convince themselves that what they're doing is okay in order for them to continue, you know, working for a place like this, you know. And I just couldn't. That was kind of that moment where I just thought, I can't do this anymore. And I don't know what to do now. You know, I think that was you know, I remember driving back to my office, to the clinic after that meeting, and just thinking, what do I do now? What do I do now? I have to, you know, start looking for something else. And then that's when 40 Days for Life ended up changing everything for me.
How was that?
Yes, yeah. So I had, funny enough, before all of that, I had stumbled upon Catholic radio and during Advent. So these videos, undercover videos, came out in January, but in December, during Advent, I had discovered Catholic radio by accident.
In your car?
Yes, by accident. We know nothing is ever accident. God incident. And that's really where I think God began to plant seeds, just a little bit at a time. Nothing, you know, very dramatic, but just, you know, over time. And where I had learned really about the truth about contraception and the different ways in which contraception, specifically hormonal contraception, can be abortifacient, just meaning that you can potentially abort through chemical means very early without ever knowing that you're pregnant. And that was kind of that defining moment that forced me to think about, just to reconsider my own use of contraception, but also it planted the seed so that I could start thinking about defending life from the moment of conception, you know. I was always of the mentality that I personally would not have an abortion. That's, you know, when I went to work for Planned Parenthood, that was where that was my thinking. Well, I wouldn't personally have an abortion, but I think every woman has a right to choose for herself, right? And so I think that's where we start to buy into the lie of pro-choice. And we never really think about what that choice is, right? So we're all in favor of choice, you know, whether you have a pizza or a hamburger, that's a choice. But when we think about life and death, that's different, right? And I was not thinking about that. I was just thinking, oh, this is a right. Women have a right to choose. You know, abortion is legal, and because it's legal, women should be able to do what they want. And it's none of my business. You know, I'm working for Planned Parenthood to defend that choice. I work for Planned Parenthood to support the woman who chooses life. I'm here to support the woman who chooses abortion.
And to protect them maybe from someone.
Yeah, and protect them from someone. You know, and so I was very misguided in my thinking of supporting that choice and really not considering who is being, you know, whose life is being taken here when this choice is made. So I never thought about the baby. You know, and so when I heard about contraception being an abortifacient, now that directly affected me. And I thought, okay, wait a second. Even though I would never have an abortion, what does that mean if I'm contracepting? Could I have potentially had an abortion and not known it? Could I in the future potentially have an abortion and not know it? Because what the listener needs to understand is the method in which hormonal contraception works. The one is to prevent ovulation, which we know doesn't always happen. It's not 100%, especially if you know someone who got pregnant while using birth control, which I do know several people who've gotten pregnant while on birth control. So we know that breakthrough ovulation does happen, but that's the number one way in which it works, is to prevent ovulation. And then the other way is to thicken cervical mucus so that if, you know, to try to help prevent sperm from reaching the egg. But the other method that it works is that it thins the uterine lining. So it thins the uterine lining of the uterus so that if breakthrough ovulation happens and fertilization happens, you now have this new life that's been conceived. it is difficult for that new life, that baby, to implant itself in the uterus because it's thin. The wall of the uterine lining's thin. And so if it's difficult for implantation, there's a potential for that life to dispel and for it to be gone. And so technically there's an early abortion. And so that doesn't always happen, you know, but it can happen. And that's where God planted that seed in my heart of what now? What, you know, you're using contraception, but not only are you using contraception, you're selling contraception.
So you are responsible.
I am responsible.
No matter that you work in a clinic that
and there's no way to even
abortions.
Have an idea of the impact that has had on the world. So there was that part of it, right? Later on, I would start to get deeper into the theology of contraception and understanding, you know, the impact that it has really on sexual relationships and marriages and things like that. But that was kind of that first early introduction to what does this mean for me? What does this mean for the selling and promoting of contraception, right? So it was through Catholic radio that I had heard the advertisement about 40 Days for Life and the vigil that would kick off on Ash Wednesday. So it was the Spring Lenten campaign. And I was really surprised by that because I thought, what are they going to do here in front of my clinic? Because we don't even do abortions here. So that was my first thought, is why, you know. But as I kept hearing, you know, the advertisement, and as Lent was approaching, I felt, number one, I warmed up to the idea that these people would be out there because they weren't protesters, but rather just prayer warriors. You know, they were out there to pray, and I thought, oh, what's the harm in prayer, right? They're not there to hurt us, you know, they're not there to protest or cause trouble. And so I also saw it as a sign that God was giving me an opportunity to ask for prayers because of the former events that had happened with the sex trafficking videos. I was already, you know, disturbed by my role at Planned Parenthood. And so I thought, maybe this is, you know, God's way of saying, here's an opportunity, Ramona, to ask for people to pray for you to find a new job. And so I started feeling very drawn to going back to my faith. And part of that was going to confession. And I hadn't been to confession since my husband and I were married and prepared for it. I'd been to confession since I was confirmed. So it had been 5 years at that point that I went back to confess. And I was very scared. I didn't want to go because I was afraid of the truth, which was I knew that the priest was going to ask me to quit my job. And I wasn't ready to hear that. And I just didn't know how he was going to respond to me working for Planned Parenthood. And so I went to confession, and thankfully, it went really well. And the priest was very understanding, very compassionate, but he was also very honest. And he said, you know, Ramona, you have to quit your job as soon as possible. And I think that was easy, you know, to hear, because it wasn't, you need to quit your job today or tomorrow, but you have to quit very soon, you know. And so I think that gave me the opportunity to have some time, you know, and feel like it wasn't really, really urgent, you know, but rather something that I needed to do. And so I went to confession, and I had decided as well to pray the rosary every day. And that was also life-changing. Our Lady, I just am amazed at her role as an intercessor. Just praying the rosary alone just started to really open my eyes to so much more. And, you know, more things were being revealed to me, not just involving the life issue, but just in my own personal life, all the healing that I still needed to go through from all the things that I experienced from my childhood, through my abusive relationship, you know, just so much that needed to be healed. And so that was part of my Lenten journey as well. And then on the third day of the 40 Days for Life campaign, I was sitting in the clinic alone. Everyone had left. And I looked out the window and there was one woman standing on the sidewalk. And I thought, today's the day. I'm going to go out and ask for prayers. And I walked out and I looked at her and she looked at me and she smiled and she waved at me very lovingly, which I was very surprised by, because before 40 Days for Life, we always had a presence of protesters on the sidewalk. And usually, they were, yelling at us or, condemning us and judging and things like that. And never loving like this woman. Was very sweet, and her smile very genuine. And of course, naturally, I waved and I smiled back at her. And I had every intention to go and talk to her, but I jumped in the car and I drove away. I got scared. And I got about, I don't know, maybe a block away, and I realized I'd forgotten something at the office. And I had to go back. And I went back and I didn't want to look at her again, because I knew if I looked at her, she was going to be nice and I was going to go and talk to her. And I did. I made the mistake of looking at her, and she waved at me and she smiled again. And suddenly I just felt almost like a physical push, like, go. And so I went straight to her, and I thought to myself, this is crazy. I can't believe I'm doing this. I don't know this woman, And I walked over to her and I introduced myself, and I told her, I'm Ramona and I'm the clinic manager, and I just don't want to work here anymore. And I was hoping that you would pray for me. And she said, yeah, absolutely. Obviously she was shocked. And she said, how about I pray for you right now? So she began praying for me. What was most incredible is that I later found out this woman was not part of the 40 Days for Life vigil at all. She I found out that God placed it on her heart earlier that day to go out and pray. And she'd never been out there before. She'd never been at another location ever. That was her first time to ever go out and pray. And if she had not been there, no one would have been there, because there was a gentleman, during the conversation that she and I had, there was a gentleman who had rushed into the parking lot in a hurry. He came over and he introduced himself to me. And it turned out that he was the leader of that 40 Days for Life campaign. And the reason he was in such a hurry was because he was caught up late at work. And he was supposed to have that hour of 5 to 6 covered, and he was running late, very late. I think it was probably 30 minutes late. And so this woman, it was as if God had put her there to hold his place, because I realized had she not come out that evening, no one would have been there. No one, and I don't know if that opportunity would have presented itself again. I may have just driven away and just thought, this is crazy, and never had done that, right? And so it turned out, Jerry is the name of the leader, and he began to talk with me, and we just exchanged phone numbers, and he asked me if he could share this with all the other volunteers so that everybody could pray for me, specifically for me. And I said, of course, I need all the prayers. I need all the prayers. I need to find another job. And it was interesting, because during that time of the campaign, there was such a dramatic shift in my personal life, in the way that I viewed not just my own relationship with God, but also the way I viewed Christians as a whole. It was really the first time that I saw the body of Christ embodied physically in others. Oftentimes, I think I would look at Christians as being hypocrites. And I never really saw them truly behave in a way that was genuine and non-judgmental. And that was really the first time that I saw Christ physically embodied in these people who were so merciful to me, who were so loving. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful because they were so supportive, and they were, encouraging me to leave my job and saying, we will support you, we'll help you. And I said, I had such a hard time believing that. I didn't know how to trust God. And if I didn't know how to trust God, how was I going to trust these strangers who were saying, you know, we'll help you, Ramona, we're going to help you. And I thought, no, you know, I don't know if I can believe that, or maybe I'm just going to be abandoned, you know. And I had all of these broken relationships in my life, but the biggest broken relationship I had was with Jesus. And I think, you know, when we don't have that relationship with God and with Christ, it's so difficult to navigate our lives. And that was really the test for me, was how do I regain my relationship with Christ so that I could trust God and then in turn trust the body of Christ, you know, that is physically here to help us and help me. And so that was part of that journey during that 40 days, was regaining my trust in the Lord, and then also seeing him embodied in the people who were loving me. And I always tell people I was loved out of the abortion industry. I was prayed out of the abortion industry, but I was also loved out of the abortion industry. And at the end of the 40 days, I was still at Planned Parenthood. I thought, surely, you know, I would find the new job and I would move on, and, you know, and no, you know, God had other plans. And so at the end of 40 days, I was still there. And I remember going to Easter Mass with my family. At that point, you know, we were going back to Mass every Sunday. I had stopped using contraception. I had embraced natural family planning, which was another part of the miracle, because many married couples really struggle with you know, utilizing natural family planning instead of contraception. And I realize now it was such a miracle, because I told my husband, I'm not going to use birth control anymore. I was just like, I'm not going to do it. And there's a method that I can learn to where we can naturally, you know, track our fertility. And my husband said, okay. And I said, this, you know, it was easy. And I didn't realize it until now, you know, later on, that, wow, that was actually a miracle, because it's normally not easy for couples to do that. You know, either the wife is okay and the husband isn't, or vice versa. And so that was part of the journey as well, was in, you know, utilizing natural family planning and not using contraception. And so, you know, there was just an incredible time. But we were going back, you know, we were attending Mass every Sunday, and we'd gone to Easter Sunday Mass, and I went back to work, you know, on the following Tuesday, on Easter Tuesday. And it was the first time that I was very depressed. During those 40 days, I was happy and full of joy, and I had so much hope. You know, there was just so much hope for the future. And, you know, I had all of these people, you know, praying for me and supporting me. And that was the first time that I was really, really depressed. And I left work that evening really down and almost in despair. The 40 days campaign had ended. You know, no one was on the sidewalk anymore. I was still in touch and in contact with those from 40 Days for Life and with Jerry, but I just felt very alone. And I remember I had a 25-minute drive home, and it was the first time that I'd driven in silence. No radio, no music, nothing. Just me and God. And I was crying out to the Lord and just really angry with him and asking him why, you know, God, why am I going through all of this, you know, but really questioning, you know, how he expected me to leave my job if I didn't have another job, you know, and we needed that extra income to survive. And I was like, God, you know, I've done everything you've asked me to do. You know, I'm not contracepting, I'm praying the rosary, I'm going back to church, you know, I'm doing everything that you asked. I understand that I shouldn't work here anymore, but give me an out. You're not giving me a way out. And I don't know why you have left me abandoned. And then I pulled into my driveway at my home, and I sat there in my car just for a little bit in silence. And that's when I turned on the radio, and everything changed at that point. There was a radio program on that I guess it had just started, and it was already preset to Catholic radio. So when I turned it on at that moment, this gentleman called in, and he was talking about all the years that he had spent praying in front of his local abortion facility, which had been like 35 years or something crazy, extraordinary. And he spoke of, you know, how important it was for him to defend life, to be there, to pray, to try to, you know, get women to choose life. And the radio host said to him the words that just completely transformed me. And she said, "Thank you for all that you do for the unborn. Thank you for your witness, for your defense of the defenseless." And she said, "At the end of our lives, we're all going to stand before God. And God is going to ask you, did you know about abortion? And then he's going to ask you, did you know that babies were being ripped from their mother's wombs limb by limb at the rate of 3,000 a day? And then he's going to ask you, what did you do?" And when she finished those words, "What did you do?" I began to weep, and just weep uncontrollably. I think at that moment, there was such I was just so grief-stricken because I realized I saw myself as a child, as a little girl standing before God at the end of my life. But for some reason, I was seeing myself as a child, which I think, you know, is significant. But I was seeing myself as a child standing before God and him saying, "Ramona, did you know? And what did you do?" And I think at those words, "What did you do?" is when I realized that I had for 3 years been complicit in the deaths of innocent babies. For 3 years, I tried to defend my position that, oh, I'm just referring women for abortion. It's their choice, whether they do it, whether they don't do it. That's not on me. I'm not responsible for what they choose. And it was in that moment that I realized that I was responsible. Because at the end of the day, while it mattered what a woman chose, yes, she has the free will to choose, but I also was responsible for not defending life. Even if that resulted in the abortion of those babies, that I still had to defend life. And I think that was that moment where I realized that this euphemism of choice, a woman's right to choose, is simply just a euphemism. You know, it is words to get us to be distracted from the reality of what is abortion, because we don't want to say abortion, a woman's right to choose abortion. We just call it choice, or we call it reproductive health care, right? Or just you know, health care in general, right? We use all of these euphemisms to try to make abortion more palatable, for us to be more accepting of what it is, because we want to ignore what abortion really is. And I think I really had spent all of my life buying into the lie of choice and being deceived by those words, pro-choice and a woman's right to choose. I had spent all of my life being deceived by those words. And it was in that moment I realized, yeah, I have blood on my hands, because I was helping women obtain abortions. I was very complicit in that. And when you come to that moment in your life where you realize what you've been involved in, and in this case, the death of human beings, the innocent, the most innocent among us, right? It is very hard. Very, very difficult and very painful to accept that reality. And yet at the same time, it was also such a beautiful moment of God's mercy. And as much as it hurt me, as much as I was broken, heartbroken, there was also this beautiful moment where I felt God's love very, very deeply in that moment. So it wasn't like I was being scolded. It was that God was saying, "I love you. And I love you so much that you have to see what you've done." And it was beautiful. It was a beautiful moment. And I knew right then that that would apply to everything in my life. What did you do? You know, what did you do when your neighbor was thirsty? What did you do when your neighbor was hungry? You know, what did you do when someone needed clothing? You know, all of those things that we turn away from, you know, that we didn't do the right thing, that I would always be held accountable for what I did and what I didn't do. And I think, you know, just moving forward from that, I realized that my life would never be the same from that moment on. And so I dried off my tears and I went in the house and I just began to cry again. And my husband, God bless him, he was frightened because he thought, what is going on, you know? And I just fell into his arms and I began to cry and I said, I'm gonna go to hell. And he said, no, you're not. No, you're not. And he comforted me. And so many people ask me, what was your husband going, like what was going on with your husband during this whole time? And
I just wanted to.
Yeah, exactly. I took the question from your mouth. Because you can imagine people ask me that all the time. And my poor husband, I love him so dearly because he loves me so much. I was always very proud and I lacked a lot of humility. And I was always very strong-willed, and I think part of that is because I always had to depend on myself. I didn't know how to depend on anyone else, and the men in my life had always failed me. And I was with this wonderful man who loved me, and I didn't know how to trust him in that way, to just depend on him and rely on him. I always thought I had to do everything, you know. And so he was telling me, I don't understand, just quit your job. The whole time. The whole time. He said, I don't understand, just quit your job. And I thought, what do you mean you don't understand? You know, what are we gonna do about this? How are we gonna pay the house? And how are we gonna pay this? And, you know, I'm like, do you not understand that we have a budget? We have bills to pay, we have a budget. And what are we gonna do without my income? And he said, just quit, we'll be okay. And I thought, no, I can't. It doesn't work that way, you know. And so here I was going through this. I felt like I was going through it alone, you know. And so there, you know, I had that moment where he was comforting me, and he just said, it's gonna be okay, you know. And nothing else was spoken, just tears. And then when I went back to work the following day, I felt this heaviness, you know, of now this sense of urgency. I have to quit. I don't know when that's going to be. I have to find another job quickly. I wasn't finding anything, which is incredible because normally I was able to find a job very easily, but it wasn't happening. So I went back to Mass the following Sunday, which was the first Sunday after Easter. We know that is Divine Mercy Sunday. I didn't know that. I didn't have a clue. Because at this point in my life, I was like a brand new Catholic. And I was not familiar with any of the feast days or even what that meant. It's May the 1st, 2011. I'll never forget the date. Today is the anniversary of that Divine Mercy Sunday, yes. May the 1st, 2011. I didn't know what that meant, but also it was also the date of the beatification of St. John Paul II. Who we know was the most staunch defender and outspoken defender of life. And so no coincidence there at all. And so I was sitting in Mass with my family, and throughout the entire Mass, I was just praying to God to help me, to give me some insight, something, some sign, anything to help me do what I needed to do and give me the strength and the grace to take a leap of faith. And he spoke to me throughout the entire Mass, through the scriptures, through the songs, through the hymns, everything. And it was during the moment of consecration of the Eucharist that it was such a powerful moment, because, you know, as Catholics, we are always taught about the true presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. And this is why this moment led me to understand not just the reality of that, but also to really finally understand Jesus on the cross. And so it was during the consecration of the Eucharist that I heard God say very clearly to me, it was when the priest was lifting up the host, that I heard God say, Ramona, have faith in me, I forgive you. And I began to cry. And it was such a very audible, you know, like, I can't even explain it, you know, just so clear, Ramona, I forgive you, have faith in me. And I cried, and I just knew at that moment what God was saying, you know, to trust. And that's with me not knowing anything about divine mercy, not even knowing that the words, Jesus, I trust in you, are written on the image. I knew nothing of that. I didn't even know what that image meant. You know, I'd seen it, I never knew. And so he was calling me to trust him and to take a leap of faith. And so when we walked out of Mass that day, I knew I couldn't go on. And I had Monday off, so we were only open 3 days a week, which is really incredible because the number 3 is very significant throughout my story and just in my whole life in general. I worked at Planned Parenthood 3 days a week, and I was there 3 years. On the 3rd day of the 40 Days for Life campaign, I went and asked for prayers, and we had 3 children at the time. I was 33 years old. It's very significant. But I went back to work. We were closed on Mondays, and we were open Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. And so on Monday, I was just I had so much peace because I knew I was going to quit. I didn't know exactly when. I had in my mind at the end of the month. But I had so much peace. And then on Tuesday, I had to go back to work. And I remember just getting up that day, just feeling so much dread. Like, oh, I don't want to go, you know. And I thought, okay, I'm going to quit this week. This is going to be it. I'm not going to go after this. And so on my drive to work, I was praying to God to protect me in those final 3 days from all occasions of sin, from any referrals for abortion, from any selling of contraception. And so when I got to work, I received a phone call from the administration telling me that I needed to reschedule all of our patients because our nurse practitioner had to cover another clinic. And because she had to cover another clinic, that meant no one would be there. I was going to be there alone, and I was going to reschedule everyone. And so I was calling all the women to reschedule them, and I didn't have to see anybody. I didn't sell any contraception. And on the 3rd day of the week, so on Friday, on May the 6th of 2011, so I'll celebrate 14 years this May 6th since I left Planned Parenthood. But on that Friday, I was probably about an hour away from walking out of Planned Parenthood when a woman came in for a pregnancy test. And on the intake form, it asks the question, you know, if your pregnancy test is positive, you know, what type of referral would you like? And she had checked the box abortion, adoption, and prenatal care. So she checked all 3 boxes. And usually in the past, when women would check all 3 boxes, it usually meant that they wanted an abortion. They just didn't want to say it. And I remember walking her to the back of, you know, the clinic to sit her down in the exam room. And I looked up to God and I thought, oh, why are you doing this to me? I'm about to leave. Why? You know, why are you doing this? And her pregnancy test was positive. And I went in the room and I congratulated her on her pregnancy. And she began to cry. And when she cried, I just looked at her and I said, what's wrong? And she said, I don't know if I can have this baby. I think she was in her early 20s. And she had already had a daughter, a little girl. I think she was maybe 3 years old. And she said, I don't know if I can have this baby. And I said, just, you know, tell me a little bit more about that. And she said, well, the father of this baby is in jail. He's abusive. And I don't know what I'm going to do if he gets out, you know, and I have this baby. And I don't know. I just connected with her on that. And I told her my story. And I shared with her the abuse that I had dealt with and that I was a survivor of domestic abuse and I told her how I found the strength, that God gave me the strength to leave, and I just shared my own personal journey. And I asked her about her faith in God because she had a little cross on her neck. And she told me that, yes, she believed in God, and she didn't know that, you know, she was more concerned about what would happen with the father than, you know, she had her family support. She had everything in place. Yeah. And so we spoke, and I just shared my own testimony with her about my past relationship and how I'd found a good man in my life. And she stood up and she threw her arms around my neck and she was crying and she said, "Thank you so much. I'm going to keep my baby." So she left and I cried and I thought, wow, I can't believe that just happened. And I walked out. I submitted my letter of resignation and I walked out of Planned Parenthood. And I realized in that moment that that was my moment of redemption, because all of the times that I had referred women for abortion, you know, I just never stopped and affirmed them in life, life-affirming choices. I never helped them make those life-affirming choices. Rather, I was just quick to give them the referral for abortion. Oh, you want an abortion? Here, you know. But it was just a beautiful moment and so profound that God would do that for me in those final hours at Planned Parenthood. And so I walked out, I quit, left my keys on the desk. No one knew it was going to happen. You know, I gave no warning, you know. And then 3 months later, I got a call that the facility was going to shut down. And I was invited to come speak at the closing celebration rally of the Planned Parenthood that I had once directed.
So, what did you do then at the rally?
Yeah, so at the rally we were...
Who called you?
David B. Wright.
Okay.
David B. Wright, yeah. So he
started the 40
he
days
started,
for life.
Yep, started 40 Days for Life. And, well, it could have been David. I don't know. It was someone on the team who invited me out, and David was there to lead the celebration. And so all the people were gathered there who had been out there praying. You know, the director of the Pregnancy Resource Center, like all of the pro-life leaders and groups were out there to celebrate the closing. And they asked me to come out and just share a few words, and I did. And I think that was kind of that moment where people were going, you know, they saw the video and they were like, whoa, wait a minute, you know, and that kind of led me to all of this, I guess you could say. But was amazing is that I was pregnant during the rally. So I was at that point 2 months pregnant. A month after I quit Planned Parenthood, my husband and I had the first of the 4 conversion babies that we have today. And despite physicians telling me, you know, that I would have difficulties getting pregnant, we had our first conversion baby, and then 3 years later we had our second. We lost one, and 3 years later we'd lost our baby, and then the doctor said that I probably wouldn't be able to conceive. I would probably miscarry again, but we conceived a month later, and we had our third, at that point, third baby. And then 3 years later, we had our next baby. And so, yeah, we had all of these new lives that I look at and I think, you wouldn't be here had I never had a conversion, because we were not open to life. We were not open to having more children or open to the blessings that God wanted to give us. And as you can imagine, it was a struggle. It was a struggle when I would get pregnant. Well, first of all, medically speaking, it was a struggle because I had to have injections, progesterone injections, to help keep me from going into early labor, because with all of them, I was already having contractions in my first trimester. So it was, you know, always the fear that I was going to lose the babies. And they didn't come premature. They all came early, but they weren't premature. And so thanks be to God, they were all born healthy. And but it was a struggle for me to have my babies. Emotionally, it was hard because there were friends of mine who struggled with infertility, who were unable to have babies. And a dear friend of mine as well who had miscarried many children. and unable to have her own. And so I think those were probably some of the most difficult times for me spiritually, because I felt spiritually attacked and guilted into feeling bad for being pregnant when other women, you know, that had lived such beautiful faith-filled lives, who had always been pro-life, who had always been close to God, were unable to have children. And I think that was really part of the spiritual attack that I experienced, especially when I was pregnant, feeling like I didn't deserve, you know, to have babies. And of course, you know, trust Jesus, I trust in you. You know, I had to keep coming back to Jesus, I trust in you, and really trying to be close to God during those times, because I knew that I should never reject the blessings that God was giving me. But of course, the enemy wants to rob us of that. So it was a tough time.
So Ramona, you and your husband, now you have 7 children together, and one of them is on heaven, right?
Yeah.
Right. Can you tell me more about the names of the children? How did you choose them, and those 4 especially?
Yeah. So my first daughter is Lorena. And it was nothing significant at the time. You know, I was a young girl. And then my stepdaughter is Savannah. So my husband, and you know, they chose that. But then the son that we had together, our first child we had together, is Elijah. And I always loved the name Elijah. Just, it's beautiful, biblical. It's just a very strong name. And
Thunder.
so I knew that if we ever had a son, you know, he would be Elijah, and it's just very fitting with him being premature, and then he just grew up to be such a tall, strong young man. And then when I left Planned Parenthood and we had the next children, we named our son Philip, and same thing, just a biblical name. Thought it was, I always liked the name Philip as well, but also my brother-in-law's name's Philip, and so it's kind of funny because my husband is one of 6 kids. And all of the nieces and nephews, someone is named after one of the siblings of my husband, whether it be a middle name or a first name. And so Philip, my brother-in-law Philip, is the only one that didn't have someone named after him. So we chose Philip, but also my brother-in-law's birthday is May the 6th, which is the date that I left Planned Parenthood. And so when we became pregnant with our son Philip, I thought it was fitting to name him Philip, and then Philip David, and David being after my dad. And then we had Ramaya, which is Ramaya Elizabeth. That's also a biblical name. It's found one time in the Bible. And so just wanted someone with the letter R after me. And then, well, before Ramaya, we lost our baby, very early miscarriage, but we named the baby Guadalupe. Just because I said I think I was pregnant with a girl, my husband thinks it was a boy, and so Guadalupe fit both. And I had my grandmother and grandfather, my maternal grandmother and grandfather were both named Guadalupe. So I thought that was beautiful to honor my grandparents, and then also Our Lady. And then Ramaya, we had Ramaya, and then we have now Zoe. And Zoe is life. It means, yes, literally a Greek for Eve, which is life. And I knew that would be the perfect name for her because I was much older. When I had her, I was under a lot of spiritual attack when I became pregnant with her, and life overcame all of that. So yeah, I thought Zoe was very fitting.
This is so beautiful. We talked yesterday. We have some of the similar things in our life, about some dates and everything. And now, as you're saying about those names, my sister has 4 children, and their names are Eve, Philip, Laura, and Elijah.
Oh, that's fantastic.
It's so good.
I love it. I love it. I call those God kisses. I think it's just a way that God just reminds us that He's always with us. Especially in my traveling, I always meet people, and we always find that there's things that we find similarities or ways in which we're connected to one another. And I always just think that God is up there just smiling and giving a little kiss to us.
Yes. Thank you, Ramona, for this talk. Thank you so much for this great God kiss that you gave us here. And I wish you blessed staying here in Croatia, Europe, and that you come again.
Absolutely. I'm very grateful to be here, and it's always such a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dragi pratitelji YouTube kanala Udruge Hrvatska za život, bio je ovo još jedan podcast Život. Ugostili smo Ramonu Treviño iz Teksasa u Americi. Pratite nas i dalje i imate još ispod našeg videa objavljene druge videe. Hvaljen Isus i Marija.